Callum Vreeth had spent the better part of his professional life studying the biochemical properties of xenoflora across 14 different star systems, which meant he was accustomed to bureaucratic absurdities. Still, standing in the sterile briefing chamber of Concordat Station Theta 7, staring at the holographic display of a forested moon, while an insectoid administrator explained that he would be permitted only wooden implements for his survival assessment, Callum experienced a unique flavor of institutional confusion. Chak, the Concordat evaluator, whose name sounded like rocks tumbling in a metal can, adjusted its compound eyes and repeated the parameters with the patience of someone who had delivered bad news to many species and expected the inevitable explosion of protest. To clarify, Callum said, keeping his voice level, I can use wood, only wood, because humanity has been classified as a non-tool dependent species. The classification is pending review. Chak responded, mandibles clicking in what the translation matrix rendered as bureaucratic sympathy. However, current records indicate humans achieved space travel without significant metallurgical infrastructure. The assessment parameters are therefore adjusted to your species' documented capabilities. Callum briefly wondered which spectacularly incompetent intern had filed that report, then decided it didn't matter. He had 72 hours on a moon with breathable atmosphere, drinkable water, and edible fauna. The Concordat's wilderness proficiency assessment was meant to be challenging, not impossible. Arguing with Chak would accomplish nothing except delaying his departure, and Callum had learned long ago that working within absurd constraints often proved more productive than fighting them. He nodded, collected his single permitted fabric item, the standard issue assessment jumpsuit he was already wearing, and boarded the descent shuttle with the resigned composure of someone who had just been told the universe's rules were silly but enforceable. The moon-designated Assessment Zone 447, Tertius rolled beneath the shuttle's viewport, dense with vegetation that looked Earth-similar enough to be useful, but alien enough to require caution. Callum studied the canopy patterns during descent, noting water glints that suggested streams or lakes, clearings that indicated either natural meadows or large herbivore grazing zones, and the general topography that would determine where building a shelter made sense versus where it would constitute slow-motion suicide by flood or predator. Chak occupied the seat across from him, sensory apparatus extended, already recording preliminary observations about human pre-deployment behavior. Callum ignored the scrutiny. Being studied was part of the assessment structure, and acting self-conscious about it would only generate useless data. The shuttle settled in a clearing ringed by trees that resembled something between earth oaks and oversized ferns, their bark ridged and dark, their canopy thick enough to filter sunlight into greenish columns. Callum stepped onto soil that smelled of decomposition and growth, the familiar perfume of active ecosystems. Chak deployed from a side hatch, accompanied by a hovering observation drone that would maintain constant surveillance throughout the assessment period. The insectoid administrator gestured with one articulated limb toward the forest perimeter. Your 72-hour evaluation period begins upon shuttle departure, Chak announced. Standard atmospheric composition, gravity 0.92 Earth standard, no apex predators documented in this zone. Water sources are abundant, you may begin. The shuttle lifted with a hum that faded quickly, leaving Callum alone except for his insectoid observer and the drone's quiet hovering. He stood still for a moment, letting the absence of mechanical noise settle around him, then started walking. Not frantically, not with the desperate urgency of someone who believed survival required immediate action, but with the measured pace of someone conducting a survey. Chak's drone followed at a discreet distance, recording equipment humming softly. Callum walked the clearing's perimeter first, examining the tree species, testing bark texture, checking for sap composition by making small scratches with his fingernail. Some trees wept clear fluid that smelled faintly toxic, others produced nothing, their wood dense and dry. He found what he mentally catalogued as flex willow saplings with thin pliable branches that bent without breaking, perfect for binding and weaving. Near the clearing's eastern edge, he discovered a game trail, the ground worn smooth by repeated passage, scattered with droppings that indicated herbivores of substantial size. He followed the trail for 20 minutes until it intersected a stream, the water running clear over rounded stones, cold enough to suggest mountain sources somewhere beyond visual range. "You are conducting environmental reconnaissance," Chick observed. The statement, framed as fact rather than question, seemed like a good start. Callum replied, crouching beside the stream to examine the stones. Some were sharp-edged flint analogues, useful for cutting. Others were smooth river rocks, potential hammers or grinders. He selected 3 of varying sizes and tucked them into his jumpsuit pockets. Other species typically prioritize immediate shelter construction, Chick noted. Other species probably weren't restricted to wood, Callum said, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. "Understanding what I'm working with matters more than rushing into construction with inadequate materials." He spent another hour walking concentric circles outward from the clearing, mentally mapping the terrain. The 6-legged creatures he glimpsed through the undergrowth resembled deer crossbred with something arthropod, their movement graceful despite the extra limbs, their eyes large and wary. They fled at his approach but didn't panic, suggesting limited predator pressure. Birds, or bird equivalents, called from the canopy, their songs unfamiliar but pleasant. By the time Callum returned to the clearing, he had identified 3 potential shelter sites, catalogued 7 useful plant species, and located 4 separate water sources. Chick's reports, transmitted periodically to the Concordat evaluation servers, began noting the humans' unusually methodical approach and low stress indicators despite parameter restrictions. Callum selected his shelter location with the same deliberation he'd applied to the survey, elevated ground between 2 mature trees approximately 4 meters apart, close enough to the stream for water access, but high enough above the waterline that debris patterns on nearby tree trunks indicated safety from flooding. The trees themselves were the dense, sapless variety, strong enough to support significant weight. He began gathering materials, selecting straight branches for vertical supports and forked pieces for joints, where poles would need to interlock. The work was physical and repetitive, hauling wood from collection points to the construction site, testing each piece for structural integrity by flexing it, striking it against other wood, checking for rot or weakness. This construction exceeds minimal shelter requirements, Chick observed as Callum began lashing the first support poles into place, using strips of flex willow bark twisted into crude rope. "Minimal means I wake up exhausted and spend tomorrow recovering instead of improving my situation," Callum replied, positioning a crossbeam and testing its stability. "I'd rather invest the time now." He worked through the afternoon, building a lean-to-frame that gradually evolved into something more substantial, a rectangular structure with the 2 trees serving as primary supports, horizontal beams connecting them, and angled roof poles creating a sloped surface that would shed rain. The joints were lashed with increasingly sophisticated cordage as Callum refined his bark twisting technique, discovering which trees produced the longest, strongest fibers. By the time the alien sun began setting, painting the forest in orange and purple shadows, he had a skeleton shelter, approximately 2 meters deep, 3 meters wide, and tall enough at the front to sit upright comfortably. Callum ate a ration bar from his jumpsuit's emergency pocket. The assessment permitted survival rations for the first day, and drank from the stream, the cold water tasting of minerals and clean stone. He spent the last hour of daylight gathering dried grass and leaf litter to create ground insulation inside the shelter, then settled against the back wall, wrapped in his jumpsuit with the sleeves tied around his waist for additional coverage. The night sounds were active but not threatening. Insect chirps, distant animal calls, wind moving through the canopy. Chick-Chack's drone maintained position outside, its observation lights dimmed to avoid disturbing the natural environment. Callum closed his eyes and slept the practical sleep of someone who had done useful work and would do more tomorrow. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the trees, and Callum's muscles complaining about the previous day's labor. He stretched methodically, drank more stream water, and began the day's priority task, cordage production. The flex willow bark strips he'd used yesterday worked adequately for structural lashing, but anything requiring real tensile strength, snares, bowstrings, binding points under stress would need better material. He walked to a cluster of trees he'd identified during his initial survey, their inner bark fibrous and strong when properly processed. The work was meditative in its repetition. Strip the outer bark carefully to avoid killing the tree. Peel away the inner layer in long sections. Separate the fibers by scraping away pulp with a sharp stone edge. Lay the fibers in the sun to dry slightly. Then begin the twisting process. 2 bundles rolled against his thigh in opposite directions, then twisted together so their opposing tensions locked into a single strong cord. Callum's hands developed a rhythm, the motion almost automatic, while his mind wandered to other problems. Trap placement, fire starting methods, tool improvements. This process appears time-intensive relative to output. Chick observed after watching Callum produce 3 meters of 2-ply cordage over 90 minutes. Quality over speed, Callum replied, testing the cord's strength by pulling it taut between his hands. Rope that breaks when I need it is worse than no rope at all. By midday he had 20 meters of serviceable cordage and began constructing his first trap. The design was simple: a spring snare using a bent sapling, a noose positioned at the right height above a game trail, and a trigger mechanism that would release when pressure was applied. Callum positioned it where the deer-like creatures had worn the trail smooth, their tracks indicating regular passage. He built 3 more snares at intervals along different trails, each one slightly refined based on lessons from the previous construction. Redundancy, he explained to Chick's recording equipment, mattered more than perfection. 1 trap might fail or miss its target, but 4 traps quadrupled his chances. Your approach emphasizes systems over individual actions, Chick noted. Humans are pretty good at that, Callum agreed, checking the trigger sensitivity on the final snare. We think in processes. He returned to the shelter and began the next phase of construction, weatherproofing. The framework was solid, but rain would render it useless without proper coverage. Callum gathered broad leaves from low-growing plants near the stream, their surfaces waxy and water-repellent, and began layering them onto the roof framework in overlapping rows like shingles. Between the leaf layers, he added bundles of dried grass for insulation. The work required precision. Each layer had to overlap sufficiently to prevent leaks, but not so much that the weight collapsed the structure. He tested his progress by carrying water from the stream in cupped hands and pouring it over sections, watching where it flowed smoothly and where it found gaps. By evening, the shelter had transformed from skeletal framework to enclosed space. 3 walls of woven branches packed with leaves and grass, a sloped roof that shed water effectively, and an entrance facing away from the prevailing wind. Callum added a final refinement, a wooden peg system inside for hanging tools and cordage, keeping everything organized and off the damp ground. Cheek's reports began including terms like infrastructure development and long-term optimization patterns, bureaucratic language attempting to categorize behavior that didn't fit standard assessment models. The third morning brought Callum's most ambitious project, bow construction. He'd identified the right wood during his initial survey, a mature branch from a tree species with both density and flex, the wood neither brittle nor overly soft. The branch was nearly as tall as he was, with a natural curve that suggested its potential. Callum spent the first hour simply studying it, testing its spring by bending it carefully, examining the grain for flaws or weaknesses. Satisfied, he began the shaping process. Working with stone tools required patience that would have frustrated someone in a hurry. Callum wasn't in a hurry. He used sharp flint flakes to scrape away bark, then refined the shape with controlled strikes from a hammer stone, removing material gradually to avoid splitting the wood. The bow had to be thicker at the center where his hand would grip it, tapering toward the ends where flexibility mattered most. He checked the balance repeatedly, flexing it gently to feel how the curve responded, adjusting the taper until the bend distributed evenly along the limbs. "This weapon exceeds assessment requirements," Cheek observed. "You have already secured adequate shelter and water sources." "The parameters said wood only," Callum replied, working a groove into each bow tip where the string would anchor. "Didn't say I couldn't use it creatively." The bowstring came from his best cordage, twisted until it could withstand serious tension without fraying. He strung the bow carefully, checking that the curve was correct when the string pulled the limbs forward. The weapon wasn't pretty, its surface still rough in places, its symmetry imperfect, but when Callum pulled the string back experimentally, it held firm and released with satisfying spring. Arrow construction demanded equal care. He needed straight shoots, which meant searching for specific saplings that grew in sunlight competition, reaching upward without bending. Each shaft required fire hardening at the point to increase penetration, which meant Callum finally had to address fire creation. He'd been avoiding it because friction fire starting was exhausting and time-consuming, but weaponry required it. He constructed a bow drill using his existing bow, a straight shaft as the drill, and a wooden base with a carved depression. The technique was simple in theory. Rotate the drill rapidly using the bow to create friction heat in the base wood until ember formed, but brutal in execution. 20 minutes of sawing motion produced smoke. 30 minutes produced a tiny glowing ember that Callum transferred to a nest of dried grass and moss, blowing gently until flame appeared. The fire felt like a significant achievement, disproportionate to its small size. He fed it carefully with twigs and small branches until it was strong enough to sustain itself, then hardened his arrow points in the flames, rotating them slowly until the wood darkened and hardened. Fletching came from bird feathers collected during his walks, split and bound to the arrow shafts with fine cordage and tree sap that served as primitive glue. By afternoon, Callum had 6 completed arrows and a functional bow. He test-fired at a tree trunk 20 meters away. The first arrow flew wide. The second hit closer. The third sank into bark with a solid thunk that made him smile despite himself. "Your accuracy improves rapidly," Check noted. "Practice and adjustment," Callum replied, retrieving his arrows. "Same as everything else." The fourth morning brought success in a different form. Callum checked his snares at dawn and found one had captured a creature roughly the size of a rabbit, its scaled fur iridescent in the early light, its 6 legs tangled in the cordage noose. He approached quietly, dispatched it with quick efficiency to minimize suffering, and carried it back to his shelter. The processing was methodical, careful cuts with sharp stone flakes to separate hide from meat, sinew carefully extracted for future cordage use, organs examined for edibility based on his xenobiology training. He murmured a quiet thank you to the creature, a habit from childhood that Check recorded, but clearly didn't understand. The meat cooked on a green wood spit over his carefully maintained fire, the smell reminding Callum that ration bars were nutritionally adequate, but psychologically insufficient. He ate slowly, savoring the success while mentally calculating that his caloric intake now exceeded his expenditure. The hide he stretched on a wooden frame using wooden pegs, curious whether it would cure properly without chemical treatment. Probably not, but experimentation cost nothing except time. "You have now secured all primary survival requirements," Check announced. "Shelter, water, food, fire. The assessment metrics are satisfied." "Good," Callum said, already planning his next project. "Now I can work on the interesting parts." He spent the rest of the day systematizing his camp with improvements that were entirely unnecessary for a 72-hour assessment. A drying rack for preserving meat appeared near the fire, constructed from green wood that wouldn't burn easily. A second, smaller shelter emerged a few meters from the main one, elevated on stilts to prevent ground creatures from accessing stored food. He carved a wooden bowl from a fallen log, the work slow but satisfying, producing a vessel that held water without leaking. A simple filtration system took shape using a hollow log section packed with layers of sand, charcoal and gravel, positioned so stream water could trickle through and emerge cleaner. Chuck's drone followed him through these activities, recording equipment working continuously. The insectoid observer had largely stopped commenting, apparently resigned to documenting behavior that defied standard assessment patterns. The fifth day, well beyond any reasonable assessment requirement, Callum continued building. He constructed a fishing weir in the stream, woven branches arranged in a V-shape that would funnel small fish into a catchment area. He carved a primitive chair from a section of log, its seat hollowed and shaped for comfort, positioned near his fire pit. He built a storage rack for organizing tools, his bow hung from one peg, arrows from another, cordage coiled neatly on a third, stone tools arranged by size and function. He even started a drying rack for plant materials, medicinal herbs he'd identified, fungi that might prove useful, additional fiber sources for future cordage. The assessment period concludes in 8 hours, Chuck finally said, breaking a silence that had lasted most of the afternoon. "May I inquire why you continue construction?" Callum looked up from the wooden wedges he was carving for splitting logs more efficiently. "I'm testing techniques," he said, "learning what this environment offers. Seems wasteful to leave after 72 hours when I'm just starting to understand how everything works together." "You are treating this as education rather than evaluation. Is there a difference?" Callum asked. "I'm learning what wood from different trees is good for, how the local animals behave, which plants are useful. That knowledge might matter someday." The drone hovered silently, processing this response through whatever logic Chuck employed to understand species that didn't think like insectoids. The final hours of assessment passed in calm routine. Callum checked his snares, one more catch, which he processed and added to his drying rack. He banked his fire carefully, reducing it to coals that would stay warm without consuming unnecessary fuel. He tested his fishing weir and found 2 small fish trapped inside, which he released since he didn't need them. He walked the perimeter of his camp one last time, mentally cataloging everything he'd built, every technique he'd refined, every small optimization he'd discovered through trial and error. When the assessment period officially ended, signaled by a tone from Chuck's equipment, Callum began dismantling his camp with the same care he'd used to build it. He scattered the fire pit, ensuring no embers remained. He released the tension from his snares, erasing evidence of their triggers. He left the shelters standing. They would decompose naturally, but removed any cordage or tools that might trap animals or disrupt the ecosystem. The assessment protocols required minimal environmental impact, and Callum had always believed in leaving places better than he found them, or at least no worse. The shuttle arrived precisely on schedule. Callum boarded with his bow and arrows as permitted keepsakes, his jumpsuit considerably more worn than when he'd arrived, and a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with passing an assessment. Chuck occupied the same seat across from him, sensory apparatus retracted, already compiling preliminary reports. Your performance exceeded all standard survival metrics, the insectoid administrator said as the shuttle lifted. Superior shelter construction, adequate food procurement, successful tool creation within parameter restrictions, and environmental adaptation scores in the 97th percentile across all evaluated species. That's good, Callum replied, watching the forest moon shrink in the viewport. However, Chuck continued, mandibles clicking in what the translation matrix rendered as bureaucratic concern. I must note several anomalous behavioral patterns for the official record. Anomalous how? You appeared to enjoy the restrictions, Chuck said slowly, as if testing the words. The limitation to wooden implements, which other species would categorize as handicap, you treated as creative challenge. You built infrastructure beyond assessment requirements. You demonstrated satisfaction in optimization and systematic organization, rather than stress at resource scarcity. Callum considered this. Humans like solving problems, he said finally. Give us constraints, and we'll find ways to work within them. It's kind of what we do. This tendency may require reclassification of human tool dependency status, Chuck noted. The current filing as non-tool dependent species is clearly erroneous, but the classification criteria assume tool use indicates stress reduction, not stress satisfaction. You could always just ask humans what they need, instead of guessing from incomplete records, Callum suggested. That would require protocol revision across 7 administrative departments, Chuck replied, which apparently ended the discussion. The shuttle docked at Concordat Station Theta 7, and Callum was escorted to the debriefing chamber where evaluation boards reviewed assessment results. The panel consisted of representatives from 5 species, none human, all reviewing data streams on holographic displays. Chuck presented findings with clinical precision, survival metrics exceeded, tool construction demonstrated advanced planning capacity, environmental impact minimal, psychological stress indicators remarkably low throughout the evaluation period. The human showed unusual comfort with parameter restrictions, Chuck concluded. Despite limitation to wooden implements, subject created functional solutions for shelter, food procurement, water purification, and defensive weaponry. Subject also demonstrated continued building behavior after basic survival requirements were satisfied, suggesting intrinsic motivation toward optimization and systematization. One of the panel members, a reptilian species with elaborate head crests, leaned forward. Human wreath. The assessment parameters were intended to evaluate survival capacity under species-appropriate restrictions. Do you believe the wooden implement limitation constituted unfair handicap? Not really, Callum said. Wood is surprisingly versatile if you understand its properties. I actually sketched designs for a water wheel I didn't have time to build. Would have been interesting to see if I could get it working without metal components. The panel members exchanged glances that suggested this response confirmed rather than alleviated their concerns. A water wheel, check repeated, mandibles clicking rapidly. For what purpose? Automatic fish trap, Callum explained. The stream had decent flow. A wheel with scoops could lift water into a holding tank, and fish that got caught in the scoops would be deposited automatically. Would have required some engineering to get the dimensions right, but the basic principle is sound. The silence in the debriefing chamber stretched long enough that Callum wondered if he'd somehow failed the assessment after all. Then Check's mandibles clicked in what might have been the insectoid equivalent of a resigned sigh. I will recommend comprehensive review of humanity's classification status, the administrator said. The current parameters are clearly inadequate. Does that mean I passed? Callum asked. You exceeded every measurable metric, Check replied. Though I suspect the evaluation revealed more about human psychology than your individual survival capacity. The panel dismissed Callum with official certification of his wilderness proficiency assessment completion, which would permit him to conduct xenobotanical research on uncolonized worlds without supervision. He collected his certification datapad and headed toward the station's residential sector, already thinking about his next research assignment and whether any of the wooden implement techniques he'd refined might prove useful in actual fieldwork. Behind him, Chuck remained in the debriefing chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing Callum's camp construction, his systematic trap placement, his careful tool organization, and his evident satisfaction while performing repetitive manual labor under significant physical constraints. Insectoid Administrator began composing the official report with the tired determination of someone who knew that reclassifying an entire species' bureaucratic status would generate approximately 700 forms across 14 departments and require committee reviews that would span the next fiscal quarter at minimum. The report's final observation noted that humans, when restricted to wooden implements and informed this represented their species' documented capability level, would apparently find 73 different ways to use wood brilliantly, expressed genuine disappointment at not having time to discover the 74th, and then politely thanked the evaluators for the educational opportunity. Chuck paused at this final sentence, considered deleting it as unnecessarily editorial, then decided it was perhaps the most accurate assessment summary in the entire document. Some species competed with their environment, some adapted to it. Humans, it seemed, negotiated with it, then optimized the agreement, then built infrastructure to ensure the optimization remained stable, then started experimenting with improvements because the stable system provided enough security to permit creative risk-taking. The administrator saved the report, transmitted it to the appropriate review boards, and made a personal note to recommend that future human assessments include significantly expanded parameter options. Not because humans needed the advantages, but because watching them work with limitations apparently just encouraged them to treat constraints as interesting puzzles rather than obstacles, and the Concordat's evaluation metrics weren't designed to measure species that found genuine satisfaction in discovering that yes, you actually could build a functional bow drill fire starter, and yes, the process was exhausting, and yes, that somehow made the eventual flame more rewarding than if it had simply appeared with the press of a button. Humans, Chuck reflected while filing the last of the assessment documentation, were going to require an entirely new classification category, possibly several.